A peasant who couldn't read walked into the palace of the Russian Tsar and within months held more power than men who'd spent lifetimes climbing the ranks. That shouldn't be possible, but Grigori Rasputin did it anyway, and the way he pulled it off remains one of history's strangest stories. January 1869. A baby was born in a mud-floored hut in Pokrovskoye, a village so remote that maps barely acknowledged its existence. The father, Yefim, worked other people's land for wages that kept the family perpetually on the edge of starvation. The mother, Anna, had already buried several children. Infant mortality wasn't unusual here. It was expected. They named the boy Grigori. The name means watchful. Whether his parents sensed something unusual about this child, or simply liked the sound of it, we don't know. What we do know is that Pokrovskoye offered exactly 3 possible futures: farming, drinking yourself to death, or both simultaneously. The village sat in western Siberia, where winter temperatures dropped low enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. Wooden houses clustered together against the cold. No electricity, no running water, no school. The church stood at the centre, its presence reminding everyone that suffering in this life meant rewards in the next. Grigori's childhood left almost no records. Peasant children didn't merit documentation, but fragments survived through later interviews and the memories of villagers who knew him. He worked in the fields as soon as he could walk. He watched horses, he helped with harvests. The work was brutal and the compensation minimal. His father had a reputation. Yefim drank heavily and fought often. The surname Rasputin likely derived from Rasputny, meaning debauched or dissolute. Some biographers claim the name came later, attached to Grigori himself. Others insist it was the family name all along. Either way, the association between the Rasputin name and questionable behaviour started early. Young Grigori showed no particular promise. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, he had no education and no prospects. Village life offered a predictable trajectory: work the land, marry a local girl, produce children who would work the land, die young from disease or injury or vodka. Thousands lived and died this way. History forgot them immediately. But something shifted when Grigori reached his late teens. The accounts vary wildly. Some say he experienced visions. Others claim he survived a near-death illness that changed him. A few suggest he witnessed a miracle that shattered his previous understanding of reality. The truth is probably simpler and stranger than any single story. Religious fervour wasn't unusual in Siberian villages. The church provided the only break from endless labour. But certain individuals took it further, abandoning normal life to wander as strangers, pilgrims who owned nothing and survived on charity while seeking spiritual truth. These wanderers were called straniki, and they occupied a peculiar space in Russian culture, part holy man, part beggar, part madman. Around 1890, Grigori left Pokrovskoye. He was roughly 21 years old, already married to a local woman named Praskovia Dubrovina, already a father. He walked away from all of it. Later accounts claim he felt called. Skeptics suggest he simply wanted to escape the grinding poverty and limited horizons of village life. Perhaps both were true. He walked to the Verkhoturya monastery, about 200 miles from Pokrovskoye. The journey took weeks on foot. The monastery was known throughout the region as a place where spiritual seekers gathered. Monks, pilgrims, holy men, charlatans, and genuine mystics all mixed together in an atmosphere thick with incense and intense religious devotion. What happened during his time at Verkhoturya remains murky. Rasputin never wrote down his experiences and later gave contradictory accounts. He claimed to have studied under hermit monks who taught him to pray without ceasing. He spoke of fasting for days, of achieving states of ecstasy through deprivation and repetition of the Jesus prayer. He described visions of the Virgin Mary. The monastery followed the tradition of Eastern Orthodox mysticism, which emphasized direct personal experience of God rather than mere intellectual understanding. Practitioners believed that through specific techniques, prayer, fasting, physical exhaustion, the human soul could temporarily merge with the divine. Rasputin absorbed these teachings and added his own interpretations. He also encountered members of the Khlistai, a heretical sect that believed sin could lead to salvation. Their logic went like this: if you deliberately committed sins, then repented with genuine anguish, God's grace would be even greater. Therefore, the path to holiness ran through deliberate transgression. The Orthodox Church condemned this theology as dangerous nonsense, but it appealed to people who wanted spiritual intensity without the boring parts like restraint and discipline. Whether Rasputin actually joined the Khlistai or simply learned from them is debated. He certainly incorporated elements of their practice into his own developing approach. He would later claim that physical contact, including sexual contact, could be a form of prayer if done with the right intention. His enemies would seize on this to paint him as a fraud and a predator. His followers would insist he was misunderstood. After several years of wandering between monasteries and holy sites, Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoye. But he wasn't the same man who'd left. He'd grown his hair long. He'd stopped cutting his beard. He wore peasant clothing that was deliberately rough and unwashed. He spoke differently, mixing religious language with Siberian dialect in a way that sounded both primitive and profound. The villagers didn't know what to make of him. Some thought he'd lost his mind. Others suspected he was faking holiness to avoid real work. But a few, particularly women, found themselves drawn to this strange man who spoke about God with unsettling intensity and claimed to see into souls. He started healing people, or at least people claimed he healed them. A woman with chronic pain said he prayed over her and the pain vanished. A child with fever recovered after Rasputin visited. A man's injured leg improved following Rasputin's touch. Were these genuine miracles, spontaneous remissions, psychosomatic effects, or simple lies? Impossible to say, but the stories spread. His wife Praskovia tolerated his absences and his growing reputation with remarkable patience. She bore him 3 children who survived infancy. When he was home, he worked the land. When he wasn't, she managed without him. Their relationship was practical rather than romantic, which was typical for peasant marriages. By 1903, Rasputin had developed enough of a following that he decided to expand his reach. Pokrovskoye was too small. He needed a larger stage. He began making trips to larger cities, presenting himself as a starets, a holy elder. The title was usually reserved for monks of advanced age and proven wisdom. Rasputin was in his 30s and had no formal religious training, but he had presence. He arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903, carrying nothing but a staff and wearing clothes that marked him immediately as a peasant. The capital of the Russian Empire was a city of palaces and poverty, of aristocrats in silk and workers in rags. The gap between rich and poor was so vast that they might have been different species. The Orthodox Church dominated religious life, but beneath the official surface ran currents of mysticism, occultism, and spiritual seeking. The educated classes were fascinated by anything that promised access to hidden truths. Rasputin, with his claims of visions and his apparent healing powers, arrived at exactly the right moment. He found his way to Bishop Theophan, an influential churchman with mystical leanings. Theophan was impressed. Here was a genuine peasant with no education, no sophistication, no guile, speaking about God with raw conviction. The bishop introduced Rasputin to other clergy, who introduced him to wealthy laypeople, who introduced him to members of the aristocracy. Within months, Rasputin was visiting the homes of some of the most powerful people in Russia. He didn't change his manner or his appearance. He still dressed like a peasant, still spoke in his rough Siberian dialect, still smelled like someone who considered bathing optional. But something about this deliberate crudeness fascinated the upper classes. He was authentic in a world drowning in pretense. The women particularly responded to him. Aristocratic ladies living lives of rigid formality and emotional starvation found in Rasputin someone who looked them in the eyes and spoke to them as if they were real people rather than decorative objects. He touched them, not always sexually, though those accusations would come later, but physically. He held their hands, he embraced them. He broke through the wall of propriety that kept everyone at a careful distance. He told them they were beautiful. He told them God loved them. He told them their sins didn't matter because grace was infinite. For women raised to believe they were fundamentally corrupt and needed constant male supervision, this message was revolutionary and intoxicating. Men had more complex reactions. Some saw through him immediately and dismissed him as a fraud. Others found his bluntness refreshing. A few recognized that he was dangerous. But none of them could deny that he was effective at gaining access to circles that should have been completely closed to an illiterate Siberian peasant. The key to understanding Rasputin's rise is recognizing that he wasn't playing by the normal rules. He didn't try to hide his origins or improve his education or adopt sophisticated manners. He did exactly the opposite. He amplified everything that made him different. The peasant clothing became his uniform. The crude speech became his trademark. The unwashed smell became proof of his holy indifference to worldly concerns. In late 1905, everything changed. A doctor named Eugene Badmaev, who treated members of the imperial family with Tibetan medicine and had his own mystical inclinations, mentioned Rasputin to the Grand Duchesses. They were curious. The Russian aristocracy was always hunting for the next spiritual sensation. An appointment was arranged. Rasputin was about to meet the two people who would determine the rest of his life, and in a very real sense, the fate of Russia itself. The Tsar and Tsarina were desperate. Their son was dying slowly, and no doctor could help. They'd tried everything. Now they were willing to try a peasant holy man who claimed God spoke through him. The first meeting took place on November 1st, 1905, at the home of Grand Duchess Militsa. Nicholas and Alexandra arrived quietly, without the usual imperial fanfare. They needed discretion. If word got out that the Tsar and Tsarina were consulting a peasant mystic, the mockery would be merciless. Rasputin was waiting. He didn't bow, he didn't use their titles. He looked directly at them, something no one did, and spoke as if they were ordinary people who happened to need his help. "You are troubled," he said, not a question, a statement. Alexandra stiffened. Nicholas remained carefully neutral. They hadn't mentioned Alexei. The meeting was supposedly about spiritual guidance, nothing more. But Rasputin continued. "There is pain in this house. A child suffers." The room went silent. How could he know? Alexandra's face betrayed everything. Here was someone who understood without being told, who saw through the careful lies they told the world. Rasputin moved closer. He took Alexandra's hand. She should have pulled away. Empresses don't let strange peasants touch them. She didn't move. "God has not abandoned you," Rasputin said. "The boy will live. I have seen it." Those words changed everything. Not because they were particularly profound, but because Alexandra desperately needed to hear them from someone who seemed to have genuine authority. Doctors dealt in probabilities and grim prognoses. Rasputin dealt in certainties. The Tsarevich would live. He had seen it. How could he be so sure? They invited him to visit again, then again. By early 1906, Rasputin had become a regular presence in their lives, though few people outside the immediate family knew it. The imperial couple maintained the public fiction that they consulted him only for spiritual advice, the same way they might consult any priest, but the truth was far more significant. Alexei had another bleeding episode in 1906. The boy had bumped his leg, nothing serious, but for a haemophiliac, even minor trauma could trigger internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. The joints swelled, The pain was excruciating. Alexei screamed. The doctors administered morphine and waited. There was nothing else they could do. Medical science in 1906 had no treatment for haemophilia. They could only watch the child suffer and hope the bleeding stopped before it killed him. Alexandra sent for Rasputin. He arrived at the palace and went directly to Alexei's room. The doctors were dismissed. What happened next depends on who's telling the story, but the basic facts are undisputed. Rasputin sat beside the bed. He spoke to the boy in a low, calm voice. He stroked his forehead. He prayed. Within a short time, Alexei's pain began to subside. The swelling started to decrease. The crisis passed. The doctors had no explanation. The Tsarina had a very simple one. Rasputin had saved her son's life through divine intervention. This happened multiple times over the following years. Each time Alexei had a serious episode, Rasputin would be summoned. Sometimes he came in person, sometimes, if he was away from Petersburg, he sent a telegram. The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much. And invariably, the crisis would resolve. Modern medical analysis suggests several explanations. Haemophilia symptoms can fluctuate naturally. Stress makes bleeding worse, and Rasputin's calming presence might have genuinely helped. The doctors, in their desperate attempts to treat the boy, may have made things worse with their interventions. When Rasputin told them to leave Alexei alone, he might have accidentally hit upon the best treatment available at the time. Or there's a darker possibility. Some historians have speculated that Rasputin himself, or someone working with him, made the boy sick, then cured him to demonstrate power. There's no solid evidence for this, but it can't be completely dismissed. What matters is not whether Rasputin actually had healing powers. What matters is that Alexandra believed he did, and that belief gave him a kind of power over the imperial family that no one else possessed. He became indispensable, the one person who could save the heir to the throne, the man who stood between the Romanov dynasty and extinction. By 1907, Rasputin's influence was obvious to anyone paying attention. He had moved from being an occasional visitor to being a fixture in the imperial household. He came and went as he pleased. He called the Tsarina Mama and the Tsar Papa. He gave advice on everything, not just spiritual matters, politics, appointments, military strategy, and frequently his advice was taken. This did not sit well with the Russian establishment. Court officials who had spent their entire lives mastering the intricate protocols of imperial service watched in horror as this unwashed peasant ignored every rule and suffered no consequences. Ministers who had worked their way up through the bureaucracy discovered that their carefully drafted proposals could be overturned by a word from Rasputin. The aristocracy, which prided itself on breeding and refinement, saw one of their most exclusive circles penetrated by someone who represented everything they despised. The attacks began. Whisper campaigns at first. Rasputin drinks. Rasputin visits prostitutes. Rasputin claims to be holy, but lives like a devil. Some of this was true. Rasputin did drink, heavily at times. He did visit bathhouses and brothels. He made no particular effort to hide these activities. His defense was theological and in its own way sophisticated. He was a sinner. He freely admitted it. But that was the point. Only through sin could one truly understand grace. Only by descending into the depths could one appreciate redemption. It was a twisted logic, but it came from a real tradition within certain mystical strains of Russian orthodoxy. The attacks escalated. In 1907, a monk named Ilyador, who had initially been Rasputin's friend, turned against him and began circulating stories. Rasputin seduced women by telling them that physical contact with him was a form of communion with God. He convinced married women to sleep with him by arguing that their sins would be absorbed by his holiness. He was building a cult, using religion as a cover for sexual predation. Some of these accusations were certainly true. Multiple women came forward with similar stories, but proving anything was difficult. The women who accused Rasputin were often dismissed as hysterical or attention-seeking. The women who defended him, and there were many, insisted he had never touched them inappropriately. Rasputin himself denied nothing and admitted nothing. When confronted, he would laugh or shrug or quote scripture. The Orthodox Church investigated. Church officials interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, and concluded that Rasputin was at minimum a scandalous figure whose presence at court damaged the reputation of the imperial family, and by extension, the entire Russian state. They recommended that he be sent back to Siberia and forbidden from returning to Petersburg. The recommendation reached the Tsar. Nicholas read it, discussed it with Alexandra, and did nothing, because whatever Rasputin might be doing in his private life, he was keeping Alexei alive. That was all that mattered. This created an impossible situation. Everyone in the government and church hierarchy knew that Rasputin was a problem. Many genuinely believed he was evil, but no one could touch him because he had the complete protection of the Tsarina. And Alexandra's protection was absolute because she believed, with religious certainty, that Rasputin had been sent by God to save her son. The Russian Empire in the early 1900s was already unstable. The 1905 revolution had forced Nicholas to accept a constitution and a parliament, the Duma. He'd done so grudgingly and spent the following years trying to claw back as much power as possible. The government was divided between reformers who wanted to modernize Russia and conservatives who wanted to preserve autocracy. The economy was growing but unevenly, creating new wealth and new resentment. Industrial workers in the cities lived in appalling conditions and were increasingly influenced by socialist and anarchist ideas. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were barely better off than they'd been under serfdom. Into this volatile situation walked Rasputin, a living symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. To the educated classes, he represented the superstition and backwardness they were trying to overcome. To the revolutionaries, he was proof that the Romanovs were unfit to rule. To foreign observers, he was a bizarre joke that raised serious questions about Russian stability. And to Alexandra, he was the answer to her prayers. The Tsarina's dependence on Rasputin grew deeper year by year. She wrote him constantly when they were apart. The letters survive, and they're remarkable documents. She called him our friend and father. She asked his advice on everything. She shared her fears, her frustrations, her dreams. She told him things she didn't tell her own husband. The tone of the letters is intimate, but not sexual. It's something stranger than that. She treated him as a combination of holy man, therapist, and oracle. Nicholas's relationship with Rasputin was more complicated. The Tsar didn't share his wife's mystical fervour. He was a devout Orthodox Christian, but his faith was conventional, formal, ritualistic. He didn't need visions or miracles. He needed a healthy son. Rasputin seemed to provide that, so Nicholas tolerated him. But there's evidence that the Tsar was never entirely comfortable with the arrangement. He knew what people were saying. He understood the political damage. Several times he tried to distance Rasputin from the court, sending him back to Siberia for extended periods. It never worked. Alexandra would fall into depression. Alexei would have another health crisis, and Rasputin would be summoned back, his position stronger than before. The year 1912 brought the crisis that sealed Rasputin's place in history. The imperial family was on vacation in Poland. Alexei, playing, fell and hit his stomach against a boat. The bruising triggered massive internal bleeding in his abdomen. He was brought back to the palace at Spala, but instead of improving, he worsened. The bleeding continued for days. The boy's abdomen swelled grotesquely. His fever spiked. He screamed in agony. The doctors administered morphine in increasing doses until they feared it would kill him. They prepared the public for the worst, releasing bulletins about the Tsarevich's grave illness. Last rites were administered. The family said their goodbyes. Alexei was dying. Everyone knew it. The doctors knew it. The family knew it. The boy himself, in his few lucid moments, knew it. Alexandra prayed constantly, but even prayer seemed useless now. Then she thought of the one person who had never failed. Rasputin was in Siberia, over 1,000 miles away. She sent him a telegram describing the situation. His response arrived the next day. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much. Within hours, Alexei's condition began to improve. The bleeding stopped. The fever broke. The swelling decreased. Within days, he was sitting up. Within a week, he was playing again, though carefully. The doctors were stunned. They had no explanation for the sudden reversal. They'd been certain the child was dying. Alexandra had her explanation. Rasputin had saved her son from the far side of the empire with nothing but a telegram and prayer. After this, nothing anyone said could shake her faith in him. He was not just a holy man. He was a miracle worker. He was the instrument of God's will. He was irreplaceable and untouchable. This absolute conviction would have catastrophic consequences, because within 2 years, Russia would be at war. The government would be in crisis, and Rasputin would be giving advice on matters far beyond his understanding, advice that would help drive the Russian Empire toward collapse. The war that began in August 1914 was supposed to be over by Christmas. Russia mobilized with patriotic enthusiasm. The Tsar appeared on the balcony of the Winter Palace, and the crowds cheered. Ancient hatreds with Germany and Austria-Hungary had finally erupted into open conflict, and the Russian people rallied behind their emperor. Nicholas renamed Petrograd. St. Petersburg sounded too German. He took personal command of the army, believing his presence at the front would inspire the troops and unite the nation. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Russian military was unprepared for modern warfare. The soldiers were brave, often recklessly so, but they lacked rifles, ammunition, artillery, and competent leadership. German machine guns mowed down wave after wave of Russian infantry. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The casualties were staggering. By the end of 1914, Russia had lost over 1 million men. By 1915, that number had doubled. The wounded flooded back to Petrograd faster than the hospitals could handle them. The dead were buried in mass graves, and Nicholas was at military headquarters, hundreds of miles from the capital, trying to manage a war effort that was collapsing under its own incompetence. This left Alexandra alone in Petrograd, and she did exactly what everyone feared she would do. She began running the government. She had no experience in administration, no understanding of politics, and no one to advise her except Rasputin. The ministers appointed by Nicholas tried to manage the crisis. Food shortages were developing. The railways were breaking down under the strain of moving troops and supplies. Inflation was soaring. The cities were restless. But whenever a minister made a decision Alexandra disagreed with, she would consult Rasputin, and Rasputin would send a telegram. Sometimes his advice made sense. Often it didn't. But Alexandra treated his words as divine guidance. Ministers who opposed Rasputin found themselves dismissed. Competent officials were replaced with mediocrities whose only qualification was that they didn't challenge the holy man's influence. The Council of Ministers became a revolving door. Between 1915 and 1916, Russia went through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of interior, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers, and 4 ministers of agriculture. Stability was impossible. Policy was incoherent, and everyone blamed Rasputin. The rumours about him and Alexandra intensified. Pornographic cartoons circulated, showing the empress and the peasant in obscene situations. Anonymous pamphlets accused them of being German spies. The stories were absurd, but people believed them because the alternative explanations were almost as bad. Either the empress was sleeping with this filthy mystic, or she was so deluded that she'd handed the government over to him because he could pray her son's bleeding away. Neither possibility inspired confidence. Rasputin himself was spiraling. The attention, the power, the constant access to wealth and influence had corrupted whatever genuine spirituality he might once have possessed. He drank heavily. His womanizing became more blatant. He held court in restaurants and bathhouses, surrounded by petitioners and sycophants. He bragged about his influence. He claimed he could make or break anyone in the government. He showed off telegrams from the Empress. He was crude, arrogant, and increasingly reckless. But he was also trapped. He'd become the lightning rod for all of Russia's rage. People who couldn't criticize the Tsar or the Empress directly could pour their fury onto this peasant who'd somehow wormed his way into the heart of power. The aristocracy despised him. The church hierarchy wanted him gone. Even members of the imperial family were calling for his removal. Nicholas knew this. He received reports. He understood that Rasputin was destroying the monarchy's credibility. But what could he do? Alexandra would not hear a word against the man, and Alexei's health remained precarious. Every few months, another crisis would emerge. A fall, a nosebleed that wouldn't stop, sudden pain and swelling, and every time, Rasputin would pray and the crisis would pass. The practical explanation is probably that Rasputin's calm presence reduced Alexandra's anxiety, which in turn calmed Alexei, which lowered his blood pressure and reduced the severity of the bleeding episodes. Or perhaps Rasputin simply had good timing. Haemophilia crises often resolve on their own, given enough time. But to Alexandra, these were miracles. And miracles don't obey political convenience. By late 1916, the situation had become untenable. Russia was losing the war, the economy was collapsing, bread lines stretched for blocks, workers were striking, soldiers were deserting. The Duma, Russia's parliament, was openly criticizing the government, and at the center of every complaint was the same name: Rasputin. Something had to give. A group of conspirators, all from the highest levels of Russian society, decided they had to act. The leader was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia. He was joined by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing member of the Duma. Their plan was simple. They would invite Rasputin to Yusupov's palace, poison him, and dispose of the body. They believed that killing Rasputin would save the monarchy. They would remove the cancer before it destroyed the patient. The night of December 29th, 1916, Rasputin arrived at the Yusupov palace. He'd been told that Yusupov's wife wanted to meet him. The palace was one of the grandest in Petrograd, a testament to wealth that dwarfed even the imperial family's resources. Rasputin was led to a basement room that had been decorated to look like a dining room. There was food laid out, wine, cakes. Yusupov was charming, playing the guitar, making small talk. Rasputin ate the cakes. They were laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. He drank the wine, also poisoned. Nothing happened. The conspirators waiting upstairs grew increasingly panicked. Yusupov kept offering more food, more wine. Rasputin kept eating and drinking. He complained of a dry throat but showed no other symptoms. Hours passed. The poison should have killed him almost instantly. Instead, he was asking for more wine. Finally, Yusupov went upstairs and grabbed a revolver. He returned to the basement and shot Rasputin in the chest at close range. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators came downstairs. They checked his body. He was dead. They began discussing how to dispose of the corpse. Then Rasputin opened his eyes and lunged at Yusupov. The prince screamed and ran. Rasputin staggered to his feet and followed, crawling up the stairs, out into the courtyard. Purishkevich ran after him and fired 4 shots. 2 missed, 2 hit, 1 in the back, 1 in the head. Rasputin fell in the snow. This time he didn't get up, but the conspirators weren't taking chances. They beat him with clubs. They wrapped him in a curtain, drove to the Neva River, and pushed him through a hole in the ice. When his body was recovered days later, the autopsy showed water in his lungs. He'd still been alive when he went into the river. The murder became instant legend. The poison that didn't work, the bullets that didn't stop him, the beating, the drowning. It seemed to confirm everything people believed about Rasputin, that he was unkillable, superhuman, protected by dark forces. The truth is more prosaic. The cyanide was probably old and had degraded. Rasputin's heavy drinking may have built up his tolerance, and adrenaline can keep a mortally wounded person moving for minutes before they collapse. But legends don't care about pharmacology. Alexandra was devastated. She demanded the conspirators be punished. Nicholas, finally showing a spine, refused to execute members of his own family and the aristocracy. He exiled them instead. Yusupov was sent to his country estate. Grand Duke Dmitry was sent to the Persian front. The Empress wrote in her diary that Russia's enemies had killed the only man who could save her son. She was half right. Rasputin's death didn't save the monarchy. It came too late. The damage was done. The murder united the public in a way the conspirators hadn't anticipated. Not in mourning for Rasputin. Nobody mourned him except Alexandra and a handful of devoted followers, but in recognition that the system itself was broken. If the aristocracy had to resort to assassination to remove one man from power, what did that say about the government's functionality? If the Empress could be so deluded that she'd mourn this charlatan while Russia burned, what hope was there for reform? The winter of 1916 to 1917 was brutal. Food shortages worsened. The bread lines grew longer. The temperature dropped. People froze waiting for rations that never came. The soldiers at the front were starving. The wounded were dying in hospitals without medicine. And the government did nothing because there was no government. Just a parade of incompetent ministers taking orders from an isolated empress who was still writing letters to a dead man's grave. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, textile workers in Petrograd went on strike demanding bread. It started small. A few thousand women marching through the streets. The police did nothing. The next day, more workers joined. 50,000, then 100,000. The demonstrations spread. The slogans changed from "Give us bread" to "Down with the autocracy." The Cossacks, traditionally the most loyal troops, refused to charge the crowds. Some joined them. Nicholas was at military headquarters, disconnected and dismissive. He sent telegrams ordering the police to restore order. The police couldn't. He sent troops. The troops mutinied. Entire regiments went over to the demonstrators, bringing their rifles with them. On March 15th, Nicholas's own generals came to him and told him the truth. The situation was hopeless. The army would not fight for him. The people had turned against him. If he wanted to avoid civil war, he had to abdicate. He sat in his railway car, stunned. He'd been Tsar for 23 years. He'd believed in his divine right to rule, his sacred duty to preserve autocracy for his son. Now his generals were telling him it was over. He asked if abdicating in favour of Alexei would save the monarchy. They said it might, but Alexei was 13 years old and sick. He would need a regent. And who would that be? Alexandra? The woman the entire country blamed for the disaster? Nicholas made his decision. He would abdicate not just for himself, but for his son. He would pass the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. Maybe Michael could salvage something from the wreckage. He signed the document. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a signature on a piece of paper in a railroad car. Michael refused the throne unless a constituent assembly voted to give it to him. They never did. Russia was suddenly without a Tsar. A provisional government tried to take control, but it had no real authority. The Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers, held the actual power in the streets. Dual power, they called it. It couldn't last. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest first at the Alexandra Palace, then moved to Siberia for their safety. The provisional government promised they'd eventually be allowed to leave Russia, maybe to England, where Alexandra's cousin was king, but the political situation deteriorated too quickly. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in November, civil war erupted, and the royal family became a liability. They were moved again, this time to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. The house they were kept in was called the House of Special Purpose. Armed guards watched them constantly. The windows were whitewashed so they couldn't see out. Letters were censored. The family understood what was coming. Alexandra wrote in her diary about her faith that God had a plan. Nicholas read to the children. Alexei, now 13, was carried everywhere. His last bleeding episode had left him unable to walk. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was woken and told they needed to move to the basement for their safety. Fighting was approaching the city. They dressed and went downstairs. Nicholas carried Alexei. They were told to wait in a small room while trucks were prepared. Then the executioners entered. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant, read a brief statement. The Ural Soviet had ordered their execution. Nicholas had time to say what before the shooting started. The bullets came from multiple directions. Nicholas died instantly. Alexandra and the children had seconds of confusion before they too were shot. But the executions were botched. The assassins were drunk. Their aim was poor, and the Grand Duchesses had jewels sewn into their corsets, diamonds that deflected bullets. Some of the children survived the initial volley. What followed was chaos, stabbing with bayonets, shooting at point-blank range, the room filled with smoke and screaming. It took 20 minutes to kill them all. 11 people died in that basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, the family doctor, 3 servants who'd chosen to stay with them. The bodies were stripped, searched for valuables, and loaded onto a truck. The executioners drove into the forest. They tried to burn the corpses, but didn't have enough gasoline. They threw the bodies down a mine shaft, then changed their minds and retrieved them. Finally, they buried them in a shallow grave and poured acid over the remains. For 70 years, the location was secret. The Soviet government claimed the family had been evacuated and that only Nicholas was executed. But everyone knew the truth. The entire family was gone. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the grave was excavated. DNA testing confirmed the identities. 9 of the 11 bodies were there. 2 were missing, Alexei and one of his sisters. Rumours spread that they'd survived, that someone had helped them escape, but in 2007 a second grave was found nearby. Bone fragments, damaged by fire and acid. DNA testing confirmed these were the missing 2. The entire family had died that night. The haemophiliac boy who'd never had a chance at a normal life. The 4 sisters who'd nursed soldiers during the war. The Tsar who'd believed God wanted him to rule. The Empress who'd destroyed herself, trying to save her son. All of them ended in a basement in the Urals, killed by men who saw them not as people, but as symbols of a system that had to be destroyed. The story of the Romanovs became a legend almost immediately. Books were written, films were made, imposters claimed to be surviving Grand Duchesses. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who insisted until her death that she was Anastasia. DNA testing eventually proved she wasn't. But the desire for a different ending, for someone to have survived, persisted for generations. Why does this story still captivate us? Why do people who've never heard of other royal dynasties know the names Anastasia, Alexei, Alexandra? Part of it is the sheer tragedy. A family destroyed by forces beyond their control. A child whose illness shaped history. A mother's desperate love. An empire's collapse. But there's something else. The Romanovs represent the end of an entire world. They were the last autocratic rulers of a major European power. After them came democracy, communism, fascism, all the ideologies that would define the 20th century. Their death marks the end of divine right monarchy as a serious political force. And there's Rasputin, the holy man who wouldn't die. The figure so bizarre that he seems fictional. His presence in the story adds an element of the uncanny, a suggestion that forces beyond the rational were at work. People remember him because he's inexplicable. A peasant who hypnotized an empress, a healer who may or may not have had real powers, a prophet who saw his own death and predicted the fall of the dynasty. The truth about Rasputin is probably mundane. He likely helped Alexei through psychological techniques, calming the boy and the anxious mother, allowing the body's natural clotting mechanisms to work without interference from stress. But the mundane explanation doesn't satisfy. We want the story to be stranger than that. The medical tragedy is easier to understand now. Haemophilia is caused by mutations in genes that code for clotting factors. The most common form, haemophilia A, involves factor VIII. Victoria was a carrier. She passed the mutation to several of her children. Leopold died from it. Her daughters Alice and Beatrice carried it and passed it to their children. The disease spread through the royal houses of Europe because those families intermarried constantly. Victoria's descendants sat on the thrones of Britain, Russia, Spain and Germany. They were all related. They all called each other cousins. And some of them carried a genetic time bomb. Modern treatment for haemophilia involves regular infusions of clotting factor. It's not a cure, but it allows people with the condition to live relatively normal lives. In 1904, when Alexei was born, this treatment didn't exist. The only available interventions were rest, ice and prayer. Families watched their sons bleed and could do nothing. The psychological toll was devastating. Parents lived in constant fear. Children grew up knowing that a minor injury could kill them. Alexandra's guilt must have been crushing. She knew the disease came from her side of the family. She'd seen her nephew die from it. When Alexei was born healthy, she probably allowed herself to hope. Then the bleeding started, and she knew. She'd given her son a death sentence. Her precious boy, the heir to the Russian throne, was marked by a disease that would cause him unimaginable pain and likely kill him young. She couldn't fix it. She couldn't take it back. All she could do was try to protect him and search desperately for anyone who could help. That desperation made her vulnerable to Rasputin. She needed to believe he could save Alexei. She needed someone to tell her that her son would survive. Rasputin told her what she wanted to hear, and when Alexei's symptoms improved after Rasputin's interventions, that seemed like proof. She became convinced that God had sent this man to save her child. Nothing anyone said could shake that conviction. Not the scandals, not the political consequences, not the warnings from family and advisors. Rasputin was keeping Alexei alive. That was all that mattered. Nicholas's tragedy was different. He never wanted to be Tsar. He'd grown up knowing he would inherit the throne, but he hadn't wanted the responsibility. When his father died, Nicholas reportedly said, "I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." But duty demanded he accept. So he became Tsar and tried to rule as his father had, with absolute authority and no compromise. It was the wrong approach for a changing world. Russia in 1894 was not Russia in 1825. The educated classes wanted a constitution. The workers wanted rights. The peasants wanted land. Nicholas gave them nothing. He believed autocracy was sacred, a trust from God that he had no right to modify. He would preserve it for his son, no matter what, except his son was sick. And the strain of protecting Alexei while trying to rule an empire broke something in Nicholas. He withdrew. He spent time with his family and ignored the mounting crises. He listened to Alexandra, who listened to Rasputin. The government drifted. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on the whims of the empress and her advisor. Competent men were replaced with incompetence. Corruption flourished. And when the war came, Nicholas's inadequacy as a military leader became obvious to everyone. The war destroyed them. Russia wasn't ready for a modern, industrial conflict. The army was huge but poorly equipped. Soldiers went to the front without rifles. Artillery units ran out of shells. The supply system collapsed. Millions of men died in the first year, and Nicholas, trying to prove himself, took personal command of the army. It was a catastrophic decision. Now every defeat was his defeat. Every failure reflected on him directly. And he was far from Petrograd when the revolution started, unable to understand what was happening until it was too late. Could anything have saved them? If Alexei had been healthy, would the dynasty have survived? Maybe. A healthy heir would have changed the dynamic at court. Alexandra wouldn't have been so desperate. Rasputin wouldn't have gained influence. The government might have functioned more effectively. But the fundamental problems would have remained. Russia needed reform. Nicholas refused to reform. Eventually, that collision was going to produce a revolution. If Nicholas had abdicated earlier, could the monarchy have survived under Michael or someone else? Probably not. By March 1917, the institution itself was discredited. People didn't just want a different Tsar, they wanted no Tsar. 3 centuries of autocracy had exhausted the public's patience. The Romanovs had ruled through a combination of tradition, force, and the claim that God had chosen them. When those props collapsed, nothing remained. The execution in Yekaterinburg was probably inevitable once the civil war started. The Bolsheviks couldn't risk the royal family being rescued by the White Army and used as a rallying point. As long as Nicholas and his children lived, they represented a potential restoration of the monarchy. Dead, they were just memories. The decision to kill them all, including the children, was brutal. But from the Bolsheviks' perspective, it was necessary. They were eliminating not just individuals, but the possibility of a Romanov return. The cover-up afterward reflected the regime's understanding that the executions would be controversial. They announced only Nicholas's death. They claimed the family had been evacuated. They hid the bodies and destroyed evidence. For decades, the Soviet government maintained the fiction that the children might have survived. It was a lie, but it served a purpose. It kept the truth ambiguous. It prevented the family from becoming martyrs. When the bodies were finally discovered and identified, Russia had changed. The Soviet Union was gone. The new Russian government under Boris Yeltsin faced the question of what to do with the remains. They decided on a state funeral. In 1998, the family was buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian emperors. It was an acknowledgement that history could be viewed differently now. The Romanovs were no longer enemies of the people. They were tragic figures, victims of their time. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized them in 2000, not as political leaders, but as passion bearers, people who'd faced death with Christian dignity. The Church was careful to distinguish between glorifying the autocracy and honoring individuals who'd suffered. It was a complicated position, trying to rehabilitate the family without endorsing what they'd represented. But it reflected how much attitudes had shifted. The family that had been executed as symbols of tyranny were now venerated as martyrs. This rehabilitation is controversial. Some Russians see it as revisionist history, an attempt to erase the crimes of the old regime. The Romanovs presided over a system that kept millions in poverty. They crushed dissent. They sent troops to fire on peaceful protesters. Honoring them as saints, critics argue, distorts the historical record. But others see them as human beings who were caught in forces beyond their control. Nicholas was a bad ruler, but did that justify murdering his children? Alexandra made terrible decisions, but she was trying to save her son. The family's personal tragedy doesn't erase the political context, but it complicates it. The story refuses to fit into simple categories. It's not a fairy tale about innocent victims, but it's also not a straightforward story about revolutionary justice. It's something more ambiguous, A family destroyed by illness, by political incompetence, by the weight of history, by their own choices, and by forces they never understood. They were the last rulers of an ancient system at the moment that system collapsed, and they paid for it with their lives. In the end, haemophilia killed more than Alexei. It killed a dynasty. The disease shaped Alexandra's personality, influenced Nicholas's decisions, brought Rasputin to power, destabilized the government, and contributed to the conditions that made revolution possible. A genetic mutation that began in one woman, Queen Victoria, rippled through European history for 3 generations. It didn't cause World War I or the Russian Revolution, but it was there, a hidden factor shaping events in ways that contemporaries couldn't fully understand. The story of haemophilia in the royal families didn't end with the Romanovs. The disease had spread through Queen Victoria's descendants like cracks in ice, weakening the foundations of multiple European dynasties. By the time the last Tsar fell, the mutation had already done its damage across the continent. Victoria's third child, Princess Alice, carried the gene to Germany when she married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Their daughter Alex became Alexandra Feodorovna. Another daughter, Irena, married Prince Henry of Prussia, brother to Kaiser Wilhelm II. She had 3 sons. 2 of them had haemophilia. Both died young. Waldemar made it to age 56, an exceptionally long life for a haemophiliac in that era. Heinrich died at 4 after a fall. The Prussian royal family, like the Romanovs, learned to live with the constant anxiety of bleeding that wouldn't stop. Victoria's youngest son, Leopold, had haemophilia himself. He was intelligent, artistic, politically engaged, everything a Victorian prince should be, except healthy. He lived carefully, avoiding the physical activities his brothers enjoyed. He married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Piedmont. They had 2 children before Leopold died at 30, bleeding to death after a fall. His daughter, Alice, inherited the gene and passed it to her son, Rupert. He died at 21 from a car accident that triggered unstoppable bleeding. The Spanish royal family was devastated by the disease. Victoria Eugenie, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906. The wedding day was marked by an assassination attempt. An anarchist threw a bomb at their carriage. They survived, but 24 people died. It seemed like a terrible omen. It was. Victoria Eugenie was a carrier. She didn't know it when she married. Nobody in her family had shown symptoms. But the gene was there, waiting. Her first son, Alfonso, was born in 1907. Within months, the family discovered he had haemophilia, a simple nosebleed that wouldn't stop. The Spanish court was horrified. The king was furious. This was supposed to be a dynastic marriage that would strengthen ties between Spain and Britain. Instead, it had imported a genetic curse. Victoria Eugenie had 2 more sons. Gonzalo also had haemophilia. Jaime was deaf, probably unrelated to the haemophilia gene, but another blow to the family's hopes for healthy heirs. Alfonso XIII blamed his wife. Their marriage deteriorated. The Spanish nobility, deeply Catholic and concerned about bloodlines, whispered that the British princess had corrupted the royal blood. It wasn't scientific, but it was how they thought. Victoria Eugenie became isolated at court, blamed for something she hadn't known she carried and couldn't control. Both sons with haemophilia died young. Alfonso was 29 when his car crashed during a drive through Miami. He bled to death before he could receive treatment. Gonzalo was 19 when he died in a car accident in Austria. The pattern repeated. Accidents that would injure normal people killed haemophiliacs. The disease made the ordinary world deadly. The Spanish monarchy fell in 1931. Multiple factors contributed: political instability, economic problems, the king's own poor decisions, but the haemophilia crisis had damaged the dynasty's prestige. The king who couldn't produce healthy heirs seemed weak, cursed. When Alfonso XIII went into exile, he left behind a country moving towards civil war and a family marked by genetic tragedy. The disease shaped personal lives in ways that went beyond politics. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, was devastated when her son Leopold died of haemophilia at 32. He'd been wounded during a hip operation and bled for hours. Beatrice had been extremely close to him. She spent the rest of her life in mourning, wearing black, speaking little. The woman who had been Queen Victoria's constant companion in old age became a shadow, broken by a son's death from a disease she'd unknowingly given him. The families tried to cope. They built special rooms with padded floors. They employed doctors full-time. They restricted their sons' activities, keeping them from sports, from roughhousing, from anything that might cause injury. It was a form of protective imprisonment. The boys grew up knowing they were fragile, that their bodies could betray them at any moment. Some families hid the condition, others were more open. The Spanish royal family's struggles became public knowledge, debated in newspapers and parliament. The Prussian family was more discreet, but rumours circulated. In Russia, the secrecy around Alexei's condition created its own problems, allowing Rasputin to gain influence that might have been impossible if the family had been transparent. Medical science was advancing, but slowly. By the early 20th century, doctors understood haemophilia better. They knew it was hereditary. They knew it affected males primarily. They could identify the symptoms, but treatment remained primitive. Blood transfusions were possible but dangerous, often fatal due to incompatibility issues. There was no way to replace the missing clotting factor. All doctors could do was try to stop bleeding through pressure. Cold compresses, rest. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The royal families had access to the best medical care available. It wasn't enough. Wealth and power couldn't cure a genetic disease. This was a profound realization for families accustomed to controlling their circumstances. They ruled empires, commanded armies, shaped the fate of millions, but they couldn't save their own children from a defective gene. The psychological impact was enormous. Mothers who were carriers lived with guilt. They'd passed on a disease that caused their sons terrible suffering. Many of them, like Alexandra, became overprotective to the point of dysfunction. They couldn't bear to let their sons out of sight. Every scrape, every bruise, every nosebleed triggered panic. Fathers struggled too. Men raised to value strength and martial virtue watched their sons exist as invalids. Nicholas II taught Alexei to be stoic, to endure pain without complaint. It was the only lesson he could offer. Alfonso XIII reportedly couldn't stand to be around his haemophiliac sons, a coldness born from frustration and helplessness. The children themselves lived in a strange twilight. They were princes, born to privilege and power, but they were also prisoners of their own bodies. They knew death could come from a stumble, a bump, a simple accident that other children would shrug off. Some became withdrawn, others, like Alexei, tried to live as normally as possible despite the restrictions. The disease forced a kind of premature maturity. These boys understood mortality in ways their healthy siblings didn't. The genetic nature of haemophilia raised uncomfortable questions about royal breeding practices. For centuries, European royalty had intermarried to keep power concentrated within a small group of families. This created beautiful family trees from a dynastic perspective, but genetic nightmares from a biological one. Haemophilia was just one result. Other recessive disorders appeared too. The Habsburgs had their characteristic jaw, a deformity from generations of inbreeding. The British royal family dealt with porphyria, a metabolic disorder that may have caused King George III's madness. Scientists began warning about the dangers of consanguinity. Geneticists studying heredity patterns used royal families as case studies. The Romanovs and the Spanish royals became examples in medical textbooks. Their private suffering transformed into data points. It was a kind of posthumous exposure. The intimate details of their struggles laid bare for scientific examination. some royal families started looking outside their traditional circles for marriage partners. The practice of marrying other royals declined after World War I, partly because there were fewer monarchies left, partly because the genetic risks had become too obvious. The remaining royal families began marrying commoners more frequently. It was presented as romantic, a triumph of love over tradition. It was also practical genetics. The discovery of blood types in the early 20th century improved transfusion safety. By the 1930s, doctors could give haemophiliacs blood transfusions with reasonable confidence they wouldn't kill the patient. This extended lives somewhat. Not enough, but some. The boys who would have died at 10 might make it to 20. It wasn't a cure, just a postponement. World War II brought advances in blood banking and plasma storage. These technologies would later benefit haemophiliacs. During the war itself, though, the remaining European royals with haemophilia faced new dangers. Bombing, displacement, the collapse of old certainties. Some families fled, some stayed. The disease continued regardless of the war raging around them. The real breakthrough came in the 1960s. Scientists identified the specific clotting factors that haemophiliacs lacked. Factor 8 for haemophilia A, factor 9 for haemophilia B. They developed ways to concentrate these factors from donated blood, creating treatments that could prevent bleeding rather than just responding to it. For the first time, haemophiliacs could live relatively normal lives. They could play sports, have careers, raise families. By then, the royal haemophiliacs were mostly gone. The Spanish line died out. The Prussian line ended. The Russian line was murdered. A few descendants remained, scattered through European nobility, but the concentrated cluster of haemophilia in ruling families had dissolved. The disease that had shaped so much royal history became manageable, just as the royals who'd suffered from it disappeared. Queen Victoria died in 1901, long before the full consequences of her genetic legacy became clear. She knew Leopold had haemophilia. She knew some of her daughters were carriers, but she never saw the Spanish princes die young. She never witnessed Alexei's suffering. She never knew that historians would trace revolutionary upheaval partly back to her genes. It's impossible to say whether this knowledge would have changed her decisions about marriages for her children and grandchildren. Probably not. Royal marriages were political arrangements. Personal genetics couldn't be allowed to interfere with dynastic strategy. But the irony is striking. Victoria spent her reign building connections between royal families, trying to create a network of relationships that would prevent war and maintain stability. Her descendants sat on thrones across Europe. The British, Germans, Russians, Spanish, all connected through her bloodline. She was the grandmother of Europe, and she was proud of it. That same bloodline carried a defect that would contribute to the weakening of multiple monarchies. The disease she unknowingly passed on would kill princes, destabilize governments, and become a factor in the fall of the Russian Empire. Her strategy of dynastic connection through marriage had biological consequences she never anticipated. Modern genetic testing could have prevented all of it. If Victoria's daughters had known they were carriers, they could have chosen not to have sons or not to have children at all. If Alexandra had known before marrying Nicholas, the match might never have happened. If genetic counselling had existed, entire branches of the family tree would look different. But genetic testing didn't exist. These families made decisions based on politics, religion, tradition, personal affection. They had no way to see the hidden factor that would shape everything. They were flying blind into genetic catastrophe. The story raises profound questions about fate and choice. How much control do we really have? These were the most powerful families in the world, and they were helpless against a microscopic mutation. All their wealth, all their authority, all their careful planning couldn't save them from something they couldn't see and didn't understand. It also reveals the limits of power. The Romanovs could execute revolutionaries, but they couldn't cure their son. Alfonso XIII could rule Spain, but he couldn't make his children healthy. The disease was a leveler, proof that some things don't respect crowns and thrones. Biology doesn't care about your title. For the families themselves, the experience was devastating. Watching your child suffer, knowing you caused it, unable to fix it. That psychological burden crushed people. Alexandra never recovered from the guilt. Victoria Eugenie lived in a kind of exile within her own marriage. These women were blamed for something that was nobody's fault, a random mutation that happened generations before they were born. The medical understanding arrived too late for the royals, but it arrived in time to change everything else. The story of haemophilia moves from palaces to laboratories, from dying princes to scientific breakthrough. By the mid-20th century, researchers had figured out the mechanism. They understood the clotting cascade, the proteins involved, the genetic inheritance pattern. They could test for it, diagnose it, track it through families. But understanding wasn't curing. Haemophiliacs still bled. They still suffered. They still died young. The breakthrough came in the 1960s with the development of clotting factor concentrates. Instead of whole blood transfusions, which were inefficient and dangerous, doctors could now give patients the specific proteins they were missing. Factor 8 for haemophilia A, factor 9 for haemophilia B. These concentrates were revolutionary. A haemophiliac could inject themselves at home, preventing bleeds before they started. The disease went from a death sentence to a manageable condition. Children who would have been wheelchair-bound could now play sports. Adults who would have died young could now work normal jobs, have families, live full lives. It seemed like a miracle. The pharmaceutical companies that produced these concentrates became heroes. They were saving lives, transforming existence for thousands of people. The medical community celebrated. Patients celebrated. After centuries of helplessness, haemophilia had been conquered. But there was a problem. These clotting factor concentrates were made from donated blood. Each batch was pooled from thousands of donors. If even one donor was infected with something, the entire batch was contaminated. And in the 1970s and 80s, something deadly was spreading through blood supplies worldwide. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, was unknown until 1981. Before that, nobody was screening blood donation. For it. Nobody knew it existed. The virus passed silently through transfusions, through clotting factors, through the very treatments that were supposed to save lives. Haemophiliacs were getting infected at catastrophic rates. By the mid-1980s, roughly half of all severe haemophiliacs in America had contracted HIV through their medication. In some countries, the rate was higher. Thousands of people who'd relied on clotting factors to stay alive were now dying from AIDS. The irony was brutal. The treatment that had given them normal lives was killing them. The miracle cure had become a death sentence. Families watched in horror as children who'd survived haemophilia began wasting away from AIDS. Parents who'd fought so hard to keep their sons alive through bleeding episodes now watched them die from an infection they'd received from their own medicine. The pharmaceutical companies knew about the risk earlier than they admitted. Documents later revealed that they'd continued shipping contaminated products even after screening methods became available. They'd sent tainted batches to developing countries after pulling them from wealthier markets. The profit motive had overridden safety. Lawsuits followed. Investigations uncovered negligence, cover-ups, decisions that prioritized money over lives. The companies eventually paid billions in settlements, but no amount of money could undo the damage. An entire generation of haemophiliacs had been infected. Many died. Many more lived with HIV, watching friends and family members disappear. The survivors carried trauma that went beyond the physical. They'd been betrayed by the medical system that was supposed to protect them. The contaminated blood scandal became one of the worst medical disasters of the 20th century. It affected not just haemophiliacs, but anyone who received transfusions during those years. Thousands died. Governments launched inquiries. Regulations changed. Blood screening became mandatory. Heat treatment was introduced to kill viruses in clotting factors. The system improved, but the damage was done. For the haemophilia community specifically, the disaster was existential. These were people already dealing with a genetic condition. They'd grown up knowing they were different, that they had to be careful, that their bodies didn't work the way other people's did. And then the thing that was supposed to normalize their lives had infected them with a terminal illness. The psychological impact was immense. Trust shattered. Families sued, support groups formed. The haemophilia community became activists, fighting for safer treatments, better regulations, accountability from pharmaceutical companies. They'd been victims twice over, first from their genes, then from the system, but they refused to stay victims. By the 1990s, recombinant clotting factors became available. These were manufactured in laboratories, not derived from human blood. No risk of viral contamination, no dependence on donated blood supplies. The technology was expensive, but it was safe. Finally, truly safe. Today, a child born with haemophilia faces a completely different reality than Leopold or Alexei did. Regular prophylactic treatment prevents most bleeding episodes. Gene therapy trials are showing promise. Some patients have been essentially cured, their bodies now producing clotting factors naturally. The disease that killed princes is becoming a footnote, but the historical impact remains. Haemophilia shaped the 20th century in ways that are still being understood. It influenced the Russian Revolution. It affected Spanish politics. It changed how we think about genetic disease. The royal families who suffered from it are mostly gone, but the scientific and medical advances that came from studying their condition benefit millions. The research into haemophilia advanced our understanding of genetics, inheritance patterns, protein function. The development of clotting factors led to breakthroughs in biotechnology. The contaminated blood scandal forced changes in medical regulation and blood safety that protect everyone. Tragedy produced knowledge. Suffering produced progress. It's a grim equation, but it's the truth. Sometimes the only way forward is through disaster. Victoria's mutation, random and cruel, ended up teaching us things we couldn't have learned any other way. There's another dimension to this story that's often overlooked. The women, the carriers. They couldn't have haemophilia themselves, but they passed it on. They watched their sons die. They lived with guilt that wasn't their fault. Their experience was invisible for a long time. Medical literature focused on the affected males, the bleeders. The carriers were just vectors, important only for what they transmitted. But their psychological burden was enormous. Alexandra's entire adult life was dominated by Alexei's illness. Victoria Eugenia's marriage collapsed under the weight of it. These women were blamed, shamed, isolated. They had no support system, no genetic counselling, no way to understand what had happened. Modern genetic counselling recognises this. Carriers are patients too. They need information, support, resources. The focus has shifted from just treating the disease to supporting families through the genetic reality. It's a more humane approach, though it came too late for the royal carriers. The historical record shows how they suffered, but it doesn't always acknowledge that suffering as legitimate. They weren't the ones bleeding, so their pain was dismissed. Today we recognise that watching your child suffer is its own kind of agony. That genetic guilt, even when intellectually you know it's not your fault, is crushing. That living your entire life wondering if you're a carrier, if your sons will be affected, if your daughters will pass it on, is a form of torture. The royal women who carried haemophilia deserve recognition not just as historical figures, but as people who endured something genuinely terrible. They made the best decisions they could with the information they had. They loved their children. They tried to protect them. They failed, not through any fault of their own, but because biology is brutal and medicine was primitive. The story of royal haemophilia is ultimately a story about powerlessness. The most powerful families in the world couldn't protect themselves from a genetic mutation. All their resources, all their authority, all their careful planning meant nothing against something they couldn't see and didn't understand. It's humbling. These families shaped nations, commanded armies, influenced millions of lives, and they were completely helpless against a single defective gene. That powerlessness is universal. We're all vulnerable to genetic lottery. Some of us win, some lose, none of us get to choose. The royals just lost more publicly. Their genetic disasters played out in palaces and newspapers, documented in medical journals and history books. But the fundamental experience, the terror of genetic disease, the helplessness of watching a child suffer, the guilt of having passed something on, that's human. That transcends class and power. Queen Victoria, at the height of the British Empire, had the same fears as any mother whose child is sick. Alexandra, Empress of Russia, felt the same desperation as any parent in a hospital. The crowns and thrones didn't protect them from that. If anything, it made it worse. Their suffering was public. Their decisions were scrutinized. Their guilt was amplified by the knowledge that their genetic legacy was affecting not just their families but entire nations. Modern medicine has changed the equation. Genetic testing allows people to make informed choices. Treatments turn fatal diseases into manageable conditions. Gene therapy might eliminate inherited disorders entirely. We're approaching a future where haemophilia, the disease that killed princes and toppled empires, might not exist at all. But the historical legacy remains. The mutation that appeared in Victoria's genes over 150 years ago shaped the 20th century in profound ways. It killed children, influenced politics, sparked medical advances, and revealed the limits of power. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important historical forces are invisible. Not armies or treaties or revolutions, but microscopic changes in DNA that cascade through generations. The butterfly effect applied to genetics. One mutation, countless consequences, rippling forward through time in ways nobody could have predicted or controlled. The mutation is gone now. Not completely. Genetic carriers still exist, scattered through European populations, descendants of those royal bloodlines who married into obscurity. But the concentration of haemophilia that once defined royal families has dissipated. Modern genetics, modern medicine, and the complete abandonment of cousin marriage among European royalty means no new generation will suffer what Leopold and Alexei endured. That erasure happened quietly. No dramatic moment, no last royal haemophiliac dying in some symbolic way. The disease just faded as families stopped passing it to each other. The last confirmed descendant of Victoria's line with haemophilia was Waldemar, Prince of Prussia, who died in 1945. After that, silence. If carriers remain, they're anonymous, untraceable, through the maze of 20th century genealogy. The Spanish branch lasted longest, 2 sons of Alfonso XIII, both haemophiliacs, both dead before age 30. The younger one, Gonzalo, died in 1934, from internal bleeding after a car accident. The older, Alfonso, died in 1938, also from bleeding after a car crash. Both accidents were minor, the kind people walk away from. They didn't walk away. Their sister Beatrice was a carrier. Her sons faced the same risk, but by then the family had learned. They tested. They knew. They made different choices. That's the pivot point, when genetic knowledge moved from theory to practice, when families could test instead of guess, when prevention became possible. Before genetic testing, royal families played roulette every generation. After testing, they could opt out entirely. Some did through prenatal screening. Others chose adoption. Some simply decided not to have children. The disease that had been a death sentence became a choice, and most chose to end it. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to eliminate. Haemophilia seems straightforward. It's painful, it's deadly, it serves no purpose. Removing it from the gene pool appears purely beneficial. But the logic that justifies eliminating haemophilia can extend to other traits. Where's the line? We're already there. Genetic screening for Down syndrome has reduced births by 70% in some countries. Iceland essentially eliminated it. Parents learn, parents decide, parents terminate. The same technology that prevents haemophilia prevents Down syndrome, prevents hundreds of genetic conditions that previous generations had no choice about. Some call this progress, others call it eugenics. Both are right. The tool is neutral, the application defines its morality. Preventing a child from suffering haemophilia seems good. Preventing a child with Down syndrome from existing seems different, though the mechanism is identical. We're engineering the human race, whether we admit it or not. Royal haemophilia was passive eugenics. Families didn't choose the mutation, but they chose who married whom, which meant choosing which genes propagated. They did this badly, concentrating harmful mutations through incest. Modern genetics lets us do it better, more precisely, with actual knowledge instead of blind tradition. But better execution doesn't resolve the ethical question. Should we eliminate genetic diseases? All of them? Only the severe ones? Who decides severity? Haemophilia killed princes, but modern treatment makes it manageable. If we'd had today's medicine in 1900, would we still consider it worth eliminating? What about conditions that cause suffering, but also produce unique perspectives or capabilities? These aren't hypotheticals. We're making these decisions now. Parents screen embryos, selecting against diseases, sometimes selecting for desired traits. China's experimenting with gene editing. We're approaching a future where genetic disease could be optional, where evolution becomes a choice rather than chance. The royal families were guinea pigs for this future. They showed us what happens when you try to control genetics without understanding them. They demonstrated that power and wealth can't overcome biology. They proved that even the most careful breeding program fails if you don't know what you're breeding for. And they showed us the cost of genetic disease in human terms. Not statistics or medical abstractions, but specific children with names and photographs, whose suffering was documented, whose deaths were mourned publicly. Leopold screaming in pain, while Victoria's doctors tried useless treatments. Alexei's legs swollen to twice their normal size, while Rasputin whispered prayers. Friedrich bleeding slowly to death, while his mother watched helplessly. These weren't abstract tragedies, they were real children who really suffered. The historical distance makes them feel remote, but they were as real as any child suffering today. Their pain matters. Their deaths mattered. The fact that they were princes doesn't make their suffering more important, but it does make it more visible. That visibility is the gift they gave us. Their documented suffering advanced medical science. Their genetic legacy revealed inheritance patterns. Their deaths motivated research that eventually produced treatments. They didn't choose to be medical case studies, but that's what they became, and humanity benefited. Is that exploitation? Using royal suffering to advance science that would help everyone? Or is it redemption? Finding meaning in senseless tragedy? Both, probably. History rarely offers clean moral categories. What's certain is that we learned from their experience. Genetic counselling exists because royal families demonstrated the need. Modern haemophilia treatment exists because doctors studied royal patients. Our understanding of inheritance exists partly because scientists traced the mutation through royal pedigrees. The cost was paid by children who didn't consent and couldn't benefit. That's uncomfortable. We built knowledge on their suffering. They were sacrifices to progress, though nobody intended them to be. This pattern repeats throughout medical history. We learned about radiation by watching people die from it. We learned about disease by observing epidemics. We learned about genetics by studying families where things went wrong. Progress requires casualties, and those casualties are rarely volunteers. Royal haemophilia is unique only in being so well documented. Somewhere in every family tree lurk genetic disasters. Most go unrecorded, affecting people whose names nobody remembers. The royals were unlucky enough to suffer publicly, lucky enough that their suffering advanced knowledge. But even that knowledge came slowly. Victoria died in 1901. Knowing haemophilia ran in her family, but not how or why. Alexandra died in 1918, still hoping for miracles instead of medicine. Alfonso XIII died in 1941, having watched two sons die from a disease doctors could describe but not prevent. The mutation appeared around 1820, but effective treatment didn't arrive until the 1960s. 5 generations suffered before science caught up. That lag between problem and solution is human history in miniature. We identify problems quickly. Solving them takes decades or centuries. Meanwhile, people suffer, die, and are forgotten. The ones who suffer earliest get nothing except the cold comfort that future generations might benefit from their experience. The last generation of royal haemophiliacs got that comfort. Waldemar died in 1945, but by then treatment was advancing. The children born after him, the carriers and descendants, grew up in a world where haemophilia was manageable. The disease that killed their ancestors became a chronic condition. Not pleasant, not trivial, but survivable. Today it's better still. Synthetic clotting factors replaced the blood transfusions that once spread HIV through haemophilia communities. Gene therapy trials show promise for permanent cures. The disease that defined royal genetics for a century is becoming obsolete. That obsolescence is recent. 30 years ago, haemophiliacs were dying from contaminated blood products. 20 years ago, treatment was expensive and imperfect. 10 years ago, gene therapy was theoretical. Now it's approaching reality. The pace of progress is staggering, almost violent in its speed, which means we're entering territory with no historical map. The royals showed us what genetic disease looks like when you can't control it. We're about to discover what happens when you can. When parents can screen embryos for thousands of conditions, when gene editing can correct mutations before birth, when genetic disease becomes optional. The ethical frameworks we're using were built for a different world. A world where genetic disease was fate, where suffering was unavoidable, where the question wasn't whether to prevent disease, but how to manage it. That world is ending. The new world requires new ethics, new decisions, new ways of thinking about what we owe to future generations. Royal haemophilia can't answer those questions, but it illuminates them. It shows us what's at stake: real children, real suffering, real consequences. Not abstractions, but specific human lives shaped by invisible genetic realities. The mutation that appeared in Victoria's genes wasn't evil. Mutations are random, morally neutral, just chemistry. But the consequences weren't neutral. Children suffered. Families were destroyed. Empires were influenced. History was altered by something nobody could see or control. Now we can see it. We can control it. That power is immense and terrifying. We're editing the human genome, making decisions that will echo through centuries, determining which genetic traits survive and which vanish. We're doing this without consensus, without clear ethical guidelines, without knowing the full consequences. The royals blundered through genetic disaster because they didn't know better. We're blundering through genetic power because we know too much too quickly. They concentrated harmful mutations through ignorance. We might eliminate beneficial diversity through overconfidence. Different problems, same root cause, trying to control genetics without fully understanding them. But we're learning. Every generation understands more. Victoria knew nothing about genetics. Her great-grandchildren knew haemophilia was inherited, but not how. Their grandchildren understood X-linked recessive inheritance. We understand the molecular mechanism. The next generation might be able to edit it out permanently. That progression from ignorance to knowledge to power happened faster than anyone expected. The gap between Darwin and CRISPR is only 160 years. In evolutionary terms, an eye blink. We went from discovering genetics exists to rewriting the human genome in less time than it takes for one genetic disease to fade naturally from a population. The speed matters because evolution works slowly. Natural selection takes thousands of generations to eliminate harmful mutations. We're trying to do it in one generation using technology that's barely tested. The confidence is breathtaking, possibly justified, definitely dangerous. Royal haemophilia is a warning label from history. This is what happens when you mess with genetics without understanding them. This is the cost of genetic mistakes. This is why the decisions we're making now matter so profoundly. But it's also a promise the suffering wasn't meaningless. The children who died, the families who grieved, the empires that stumbled, all of it advanced human knowledge. We learned from their experience. We built better medicine. We developed genetic science. Their tragedy created the tools that might prevent future tragedies. That's not redemption exactly. Nothing redeems a child's suffering, but it's something. Meaning extracted from pain. Progress built on sacrifice. The long arc of history bending toward understanding. The mutation that killed Leopold and Alexei and dozens of others is now a case study in medical textbooks. The disease that terrified royal families is now treatable, maybe soon curable. The genetic mystery that confounded Victoria's doctors is now understood at the molecular level. That transformation happened because people suffered, because doctors studied their suffering, because scientists traced the patterns, because researchers developed treatments. It happened through work and luck and time. It wasn't inevitable. It required countless people making countless decisions, most of them forgotten now, their contributions absorbed into the great anonymous current of progress. The story ends not with a conclusion, but a continuation. Royal haemophilia is history, but genetic disease isn't. New mutations appear constantly. New challenges emerge. The fight against genetic suffering continues in different forms with different tools. We're better equipped now. We understand more, we can do more, but we're also making bigger decisions with less certainty about their consequences. The power to prevent genetic disease is also the power to reshape humanity. That power demands wisdom we're still developing. The royals didn't have that power. They could only watch as genetics played out its brutal logic. We have the power, which means we have the responsibility. What we do with it will define the next chapter of human evolution. One we're writing ourselves, rather than letting nature write. That's the real legacy of royal haemophilia. Not the specific disease which is fading into history, but the lesson that genetics matter, that invisible forces shape lives, that power and wealth can't overcome biology, and that knowledge, however, slowly gained, eventually produces the tools to reshape reality itself. Looking back across this entire story, from Victoria's mutation to CRISPR gene editing, from dying princes to laboratory cures, the arc is clear. We went from complete helplessness to unprecedented control in roughly 150 years. That's nothing. Evolutionary timescales measure change in millions of years. We compressed genetic revolution into 5 generations. The speed created casualties, royal children who died just before treatments arrived, haemophiliacs infected with HIV from the medicine that was supposed to save them, families torn apart by guilt over mutations they didn't understand. Every advance came too late for someone, but the advance came. That matters. Progress is cruel in its timing, but undeniable in its trajectory. Leopold died screaming in 1884. Today, a child with his exact condition takes the injection and plays soccer. The gap between those realities is almost incomprehensible. We did that. Not gods, not nature, not fate. human beings working slowly, making mistakes, learning from failure, building knowledge molecule by molecule until we understood enough to intervene. The scientific method applied to suffering until suffering decreased. Royal haemophilia was never just about royalty. It was never just about one disease. It was a preview of every genetic challenge humanity would face. How do we deal with inherited conditions? Who decides what's worth preventing? What are we willing to sacrifice for genetic perfection? Where does treatment end and eugenics begin? These questions didn't disappear when haemophilia became manageable. They intensified. Now we're asking them about hundreds of conditions, making decisions that will reshape the human genome permanently. The stakes are higher because the power is greater. The royals showed us what not to do. Don't marry your cousins. Don't hide genetic problems. Don't let pride override biology. Don't assume power protects you from nature. These seem obvious now. They weren't obvious in 1850. They also showed us something harder to articulate. That suffering can have meaning without being deserved. That tragedy can advance knowledge without being justified. That individual pain can create collective progress without making the pain worthwhile. These are uncomfortable truths. We want suffering to be meaningless or redemptive, never this awkward middle ground where it's both. But that's where we live. In the middle ground between random cruelty and cosmic purpose. Mutations happen randomly. We give them meaning through how we respond. Victoria's mutation was chance. What humanity did with that chance, the research, the treatments, the knowledge gained, that was choice. Every genetic disease tells this same story at different scales. Sickle cell, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, thousands of conditions, each affecting thousands of families. Royal haemophilia is just a version that got documented in palaces and preserved in history books. The suffering wasn't special. The visibility was. That visibility is the gift. Not a gift anyone wanted to give or receive, but a gift nonetheless. We learned from watching them suffer. We built medicine from studying their disease. We developed ethics from wrestling with their dilemmas. They were guinea pigs for genetics, involuntary pioneers of a science that didn't exist when they were born. The last royal haemophiliac died in 1945. Almost nobody alive today remembers when the disease was a death sentence. We're 2 generations removed from that reality. The children being born now with haemophilia will grow up in a world where gene therapy might cure them permanently. 3 generations from untreatable to manageable to potentially cured. That acceleration is dizzying, and it's not slowing down. The next genetic revolution is already starting. Designer babies, embryo selection, gene editing, all moving from science fiction to medical reality. We're approaching capabilities that would have seemed godlike to Victoria's doctors. The question is what we do with those capabilities. The royals can't answer that. They're gone. Their suffering historical. Their lessons learned. But the framework remains. Genetics shapes lives invisibly. Power doesn't overcome biology. Knowledge accumulates slowly, then transforms everything suddenly. Suffering can advance understanding without being justified by it. These principles hold regardless of technology. Whether we're watching haemophiliac princes bleed to death or editing embryos to prevent genetic disease, the underlying reality is the same. We're fragile biological machines made of chemistry we're only beginning to understand, trying to control processes we barely grasp, making decisions with consequences we can't fully predict. The difference is we're making those decisions now instead of having them made for us by random mutation and natural selection. That's progress. It's also terrifying. The responsibility that comes with genetic power is crushing. Get it right, and we eliminate suffering. Get it wrong, and we damage humanity permanently. Royal haemophilia is a case study in getting it wrong, then slowly, painfully, getting it right. The wrong part took a century. The right part is still developing. That ratio should humble us. We're very good at creating problems, slower at solving them, and worst at predicting consequences. But we keep trying. That persistence is maybe the real story here. Not the mutation, not the princes, not the revolutions, but the steady accumulation of knowledge despite setbacks. Doctors who studied haemophilia for decades without breakthroughs. Researchers who pursued dead ends. Scientists who built on each other's work across generations. Progress made by people who died before seeing results. That's less dramatic than Rasputin's murder or the fall of the Romanovs, but it's more important. The spectacular events made headlines. The quiet work made cures. Both are part of the story, but only one actually helped the next generation of haemophiliacs. We're still doing that work. Different diseases now, better tools, same process, observation, hypothesis, experiment, failure, refinement, breakthrough. The scientific method grinding forward, turning suffering into data, data into understanding, understanding into intervention. It's not pretty, it's not fast, it's not fair to the people who suffer while we figure it out. But it works, slowly, imperfectly, with tragic delays and bitter ironies. It works. We know more than we did. We can do more than we could. We'll know more tomorrow than we know today. That trajectory offers hope without erasing pain. The children who died from haemophilia really died. Their suffering was real. Their loss matters. Nothing we discover now changes their experience, but it might change someone else's future experience, which is all we can offer the dead. Not resurrection, just preventing repetition. Royal haemophilia repeated for 5 generations before medicine caught up. That's 5 generations of suffering that could have been prevented if knowledge had come faster. But knowledge doesn't arrive on demand. It accumulates through work. The work is happening now for other diseases, other conditions, other families who don't yet know they're at risk. Somewhere a mutation is happening right now, a copying error during cell division, a cosmic ray hitting DNA, random chemistry producing random change. Most mutations do nothing. Some cause disease, a tiny fraction improve function. We can't prevent mutations, we can only respond to them. How we respond defines us. The royals responded with denial, secrecy, and eventually desperate faith in mystics. We're responding with genetic screening, gene therapy, and systematic research. Better response, better outcomes, same underlying challenge. Biology is complicated, and we're part of biology, whether we like it or not. That's the humbling part. All our technology, all our knowledge, all our power, we're still subject to the same forces that killed Prince Leopold. Different probabilities, better interventions, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. We're meat machines running on chemistry, and chemistry sometimes fails. The question isn't whether we'll eliminate all genetic disease. We won't. Mutations keep happening, new problems keep emerging. The question is how we handle the reality of genetic imperfection. Do we treat it as tragedy, challenge, or just part of being alive? Do we pursue elimination at all costs or accept some level of diversity, even when diversity includes disease? Royal haemophilia doesn't answer these questions, but it forces us to ask them. A mutation that killed princes is now treatable. Should we eliminate it entirely? What about conditions that are less severe? What about traits that aren't diseases but aren't optimal? Where do we stop? These are the questions that will define the next century. Not whether we can edit genes, we can, but whether we should, and if so, how much. The royals stumbled into genetic disaster through ignorance. We might stumble into genetic catastrophe through overconfidence. Or we might get it right. We might develop wisdom alongside power. We might learn to use genetic technology carefully, ethically, with genuine respect for complexity we don't fully understand. That's possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. The story of royal haemophilia suggests caution. It took 140 years from first appearance to effective treatment. 40 of those years we thought we had a solution. Concentrated clotting factors. And that solution killed thousands through HIV contamination. Even when we think we've solved the problem, we might be creating new problems we can't see yet. That's not an argument for paralysis. It's an argument for humility, for moving forward carefully, for remembering that genetics is complicated and our understanding is incomplete, and the consequences of mistakes echo through generations. The royals paid for their mistakes with their children's lives, their empires, their legacies. We'll pay for ours too, though we don't yet know the price. Maybe we'll get lucky and the price will be small. Maybe we'll look back from 2150 and wonder why we worried so much, the same way we look back at fears about vaccination or antibiotics that turned out to be groundless. Or maybe future generations will look back at us the way we look at the royals, sympathetic to their situation, horrified by their choices, grateful they made the mistakes so we didn't have to. Either way, we're making history right now. The decisions we make about genetics in the next 20 years will shape humanity for centuries. That's the weight we carry. That's the legacy of royal haemophilia, transmitted not through genes, but through knowledge.